The training hall smelled like ozone and melted plastic. That should have been my first warning. I'm Kelvar, by the way. Third cycle tactical instructor at the Galactic Combat Academy, which sounds way more impressive than it actually is. Mostly I teach spoiled rich kids from Council Worlds how not to accidentally vaporize themselves with their own plasma rifles. It's a living. Barely.so there I was, standing in front of 23 students, holding up a standard issue pulse carbine like it was the most fascinating thing in the universe. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Energy weapons, I announced, my 4 vocal cords producing that harmonic resonance that my species is so annoyingly proud of. The pinnacle of modern warfare. Clean, efficient, and most importantly, civilized. A few tentacles nodded approvingly. Some antennae twitched in agreement. Standard stuff. For the next rotation, we will focus exclusively on energy-based combat systems. Plasma, particle beams, electromagnetic pulse devices. Nothing else. Are we clear? That's when the human raised his hand, Marcus Hayes. I'd been briefed about him, of course. Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 40 cycles ago, which in cosmic terms meant they'd basically just learned to use the toilet. Their homeworld was some backwater rock and a forgettable spiral arm, and their technology was so primitive that our archaeologists used it as a reference point for early industrial phase civilizations. But the Council, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that humans deserved representation in military academies. Something about diversity of tactical perspectives and unique evolutionary advantages. Political nonsense, if you ask me. Yes, Marcus? I tried to keep the exasperation out of my voice. Tried being the operative word. Question, sir. He stood up, and I was reminded of how unsettlingly tall humans were. 2 meters of bipedal muscle wrapped in that weird single-layer skin they insisted was adequate. When you say energy weapons only, do you mean for the entire combat simulation tomorrow? Did I stutter? Okay, that came out more aggressive than I intended. Yes, Marcus. Energy weapons. Only. It's literally called Advanced Energy Weapons Tactical Simulation. The name is not subtle. A few students chittered nervously. Humans apparently had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. Marcus nodded slowly, his face doing that thing human faces do where they don't actually reveal what they're thinking. Terrifying, honestly. Understood, sir. The rest of the class proceeded normally. I demonstrated proper plasma rifle stance, corrected a Vaxian student who kept trying to hold his weapon with his gill flaps, and confiscated a miniature singularity generator from a student who definitely should not have had access to 1. Standard Tuesday. The next morning, I arrived at Combat Arena 7 with my usual pre-simulation anxiety. These exercises always went wrong somehow. Last month, a student had accidentally created a small temporal loop, and I'd lived through the same 15 minutes 6 times. I still have nightmares about it. The arena was a sight to behold, though. 50,000 square meters of adaptive terrain, holographic enemy projections, and enough safety protocols to satisfy even the most paranoid insurance adjusters. The walls could withstand direct hits from military-grade ordnance, and the medical bay was stocked with regeneration pods for every species currently enrolled, students filed in wearing their combat suits, energy weapons gleaming under the artificial lighting. I did a quick count. 23 present and accounted for, then I noticed Marcus was standing off to the side, and at first, I thought he'd forgotten his weapon. But no, he had something strapped to his back. Something that definitely was not an energy weapon. Marcus. My voice echoed across the arena. What is that? He turned, and I got my first good look at it. A long, slightly curved piece of metal in a worn sheath. Primitive doesn't even begin to describe it. This? Marcus patted the object affectionately. This is a sword, sir. The arena went dead silent. You could have heard a photon drop. A sword, I repeated, my translator working overtime to make sure I'd heard correctly. You brought a sword to an energy weapons exercise. Yes, sir. A piece of sharpened metal. Well, technically it's folded steel with a high carbon content, but yes, essentially. I felt my blood vessels constricting, which in my species is a sign of imminent rage-induced molting. Not pleasant. Marcus, did you perhaps misunderstand the very clear, very explicit instructions about this being an energy weapons-only exercise? No, sir. I understood perfectly. Then why, I said, each word coming out like I was chewing gravel, are you holding a sword? Marcus smiled. Humans have too many teeth. It's unnatural. Because, sir, you said this was a combat simulation. You didn't say it was an energy weapon examination. Combat implies defeating opponents through superior tactics and application of force. The specific tool is secondary to the outcome. A Threnian student made a sound like escaping gas, which was their version of laughter. I silenced them with a glare. That's semantics. That's tactics, sir. Oh, this little. I took a deep breath through my secondary respiratory system. Professional. Stay professional. Fine, I said, surprising myself. You want to use a sword against opponents with plasma rifles and particle beam cannons? Be my guest. When you're vaporized in the first 30 seconds, maybe you'll learn something about respecting modern warfare. Marcus just nodded and moved to his starting position. I initialized the simulation. Standard urban combat scenario. 3 enemy positions, elevated sniper points, multiple approach vectors. The holographic opponents were armed with military-grade energy weapons programmed to simulate lethal force. The students' suits would register hits and injuries, complete with haptic feedback. Pain, but not permanent damage. Begin. Plasma fire erupted immediately. Students scattered, taking cover behind debris and building facades. Energy beams scorched the air, leaving trails of ionized particles. Standard tactical response, then Marcus moved. I've watched thousands of combat simulations. I've seen species with naturally enhanced reflexes, genetically engineered warriors, and AI-augmented soldiers. I thought I'd seen every variation of combat movement possible. I was wrong. Marcus didn't run. He flowed. One moment he was behind cover, the next he was 3 meters to the left, that ridiculous sword somehow already out of its sheath. A holographic enemy appeared on his flank, particle rifle charging. Marcus was faster. The sword moved in an arc that seemed to defy basic physics, intersecting the hologram's weapon hand. The suit registered a critical hit. The enemy simulation dissolved. Lucky, I muttered, then he did it again. And again, he was using the terrain like he'd designed it himself, rolling behind obstacles a fraction of a second before plasma bolts scorched where he'd been standing. The sword never stopped moving, a continuous flow of metal that somehow always ended up exactly where it needed to be. A sniper simulation locked onto him from an elevated position. I watched the targeting laser paint his back. This was it. No way he could. Marcus spun, and I swear on my ancestral spawning grounds, he deflected the energy beam with his sword. That's impossible. I shouted at no one in particular, but the sensors didn't lie. The blade had somehow disrupted the particle beam's coherence, scattering it harmlessly. Marcus was already moving again, closing the distance to the sniper position in a series of movements that looked more like controlled falling than running. The sword flashed. Another simulated casualty. Around him, other students were engaging in standard tactical firefights. Effective, certainly. But compared to what Marcus was doing, they looked like they were moving through syrup. 15 minutes into the simulation, half the enemy positions were eliminated. Marcus was responsible for 70% of them, with a sword. A primitive, outdated, absurdly low-tech piece of sharpened metal. My world was crumbling. Had to sit down. Actually sit down, which is something I never do during simulations because it looks unprofessional. But my leg joints were refusing to support my body weight, probably because my brain was having some kind of existential crisis. Instructor Kelvar, are you all right? My assistant, a well-meaning Polynesian named Drift, hovered nearby with what I assumed was concern. Hard to tell with beings made primarily of gas. Fine, I lied. Just observing. Observing. Right. What I was actually doing was watching a human with a medieval weapon systematically dismantle a combat scenario designed by the best tactical programmers in 3 sectors. The other students had noticed too. A Kranix named Voss, who'd been heading toward an enemy position, just stopped and stared as Marcus vaulted over a barrier, sword extended, and took out 2 holographic opponents in a single flowing motion. Sir, Voss clicked through his translator, is that allowed? Apparently, I said weakly. The simulation continued. Marcus had now reached the central plaza where the primary objective waited, a hardened bunker position with overlapping fields of fire. Standard doctrine said you needed sustained plasma bombardment or a precision missile strike to crack it. 3 students were already pinned down, unable to advance without getting shredded by defensive fire. Marcus didn't slow down, he sprinted straight at the bunker, which was suicide. Had to be. The defensive systems activated, multiple particle cannons tracking his approach. I found myself leaning forward despite my better judgment. This was it. The moment where reality reasserted itself and the human learned that bravery was no substitute for proper firepower. The cannons fired, Marcus dropped into a slide that would have made a professional athlete weep with envy, passing under the energy beams by centimeters. His momentum carried him right to the bunker wall where the defensive cannons couldn't angle low enough to target him. Then he did something that made my primary heart skip a beat, stabbed the sword into the bunker wall and used it as a climbing anchor, pulling himself up the supposedly unscalable surface. The blade shouldn't have been able to pierce the reinforced material. It did anyway. He repeated the motion, literally climbing the wall by stabbing it with his sword, until he reached the top access hatch. One guard simulation emerged. The sword moved. The guard disappeared. Marcus dropped into the bunker. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The other students held their positions, weapons trained on the bunker entrance, waiting. Then the defensive systems powered down. The bunker registered as captured. Simulation complete. 22 minutes. The fastest completion time I'd ever recorded was 37 minutes, and that was by a team of Valkyrie commandos with 15 years of experience each. Marcus emerged from the bunker, sword sheathed, not even breathing hard. His combat suit showed minimal damage. 3 minor plasma burns, all superficial. I stood up because sitting was no longer an option. My body needed to move or I was going to molt right there in the observation deck. All students, return to staging area for debriefing, I announced, my voice probably carrying more edge than intended. They filed in, most looking shell-shocked. A few couldn't stop glancing at Marcus, who'd taken a position at the back of the group with what appeared to be studied casualness. Well, I began, then stopped because I genuinely had no idea what to say. Start with the obvious, I suppose. That was unconventional. Understatement of the cycle. Marcus. I focused on him like a targeting computer. Explain. He shrugged, which is a human gesture that can mean approximately 700 different things depending on context. Helpful. I used the tools available to complete the objective, sir. The tools available, I repeated. The simulation provided energy weapons. Multiple types. You had access to the Academy's entire arsenal. I had access to my sword, sir. A weapon I've trained with since I was 12 years old. That's 18 years of practice. Why would I use something I've trained with for 3 months when I have something I've mastered over nearly 2 decades? The logic was infuriating because it almost made sense. Because, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts, swords are obsolete. They've been obsolete for thousands of cycles. Every civilized species in the galaxy abandoned bladed weapons when they discovered directed energy. They're relics, museum pieces, historical curiosities at best. Obsolete, Marcus said thoughtfully. Interesting word choice, sir. It's the correct word. Is it though? He unsheathed the sword slowly, holding it up so the lights reflected off the blade. This weapon has no power source to fail. No ammunition to deplete. No electronic systems to jam or hack. It works in electromagnetic dead zones, underwater, in vacuum, during solar flares, and in the presence of quantum disruptors. It's never obsolete because it's never dependent on anything except the person holding it. A Thraxian student raised a tentacle. But energy weapons have superior range and stopping power. Range, Marcus agreed. Absolutely. But combat isn't always about range. The bunker scenario proves that. You had all the range in the world, and you were still pinned down. Sometimes you need to get close. Sometimes close is the only option. You deflected a particle beam, Voss said, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. With a sword. How? Marcus smiled that unsettling smile again. The blade's edge is incredibly thin and moving incredibly fast. When it intersects with a particle beam at the right angle, it creates a disruption field just large enough to scatter the beam's coherence. It's not mystical, it's just physics. Just physics, I muttered. He says just physics like he didn't just violate a dozen combat doctrine principles. Which principles, sir? Marcus asked, and I realized he was genuinely curious, not being sarcastic. I opened my mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. All of them. The principle of maintaining distance. The principle of superior firepower. The principle of not bringing a knife to a gunfight. Sword, sir. Not a knife. There's a difference. Not helping, Marcus. He sheathed the weapon. Sir, with respect, I think the problem isn't the sword. The problem is assumption. Everyone assumes that newer means better, that technology always trumps technique, that the latest weapon automatically makes older weapons worthless. But warfare isn't just about the weapon. It's about the warrior. Drift made a sound like wind chimes, which meant he was thinking. The human has a point, instructor. We spend so much time teaching students about weapon systems that we sometimes forget to teach them about adaptability. Don't you start, I warned him, but my hearts weren't in it, and Marcus continued. This sword was forged on Earth approximately 400 years ago. That's before we had spaceflight, before we had computers, before we had anything that you would recognize as modern technology. The smith who made it spent months folding the steel, shaping it, perfecting it. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to create something that would last. He ran a hand along the sheath. This blade has been passed down through 5 generations of my family. It's seen wars, duels, ceremonies, and now, apparently, galactic combat simulations. And it works just as well today as it did 4 centuries ago because good design is timeless. But surely, a Vaxian student interjected, you must see how impractical it is for modern combat. What happens when you face an enemy at 1,000 meters? Or in space? Or behind heavy armor? Then I lose, Marcus said simply. I'm not claiming the sword is perfect or universally superior. I'm saying it has a place. It's a tool, and like all tools, it excels in specific circumstances. The difference is that everyone has forgotten those circumstances exist because they're so focused on the new and shiny. I felt like I'd been teaching combat theory for my entire adult life only to discover I'd missed something fundamental. It was not a pleasant feeling. So what you're saying, I said slowly, is that we've become so dependent on technology that we've forgotten the basics. I'm saying that technology should enhance a warrior, not replace them. The sword doesn't make decisions. It doesn't have tactical subroutines or targeting algorithms. It's just metal. Which means every success, every victory, comes from the person wielding it. That's a kind of purity that I think warfare has lost somewhere along the way. The arena was silent except for the hum of cooling systems. Voss finally spoke. How old is that fighting style you used? Marcus thought about it. The specific school? About 600 years. But the principles go back thousands of years. This predates your civilization, most of your civilizations actually. Humans were killing each other with swords when your ancestors were still figuring out fire. We've had a lot of time to get good at it. That's terrifying, Voss said. That's humanity, Marcus replied. I looked at my class, really looked at them. 23 students from 17 different worlds, all training to become warriors, all convinced that the latest technology was the answer to every tactical problem. Maybe they needed to be terrified occasionally. All right, I said, surprising myself. New rule. Next simulation, anyone can bring whatever weapon they want. Energy, kinetic, chemical, bladed, I don't care. We're going to explore this idea that maybe, just maybe, the old ways have something to teach us. Marcus grinned. Should be interesting, sir. Interesting, I agreed. That's one word for it. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly about weapon choices, Drift floated beside me. That was unexpected. Everything about humans is unexpected, I said. That's probably their most dangerous weapon actually. Not the sword, not their technology, not even their absurd physical capabilities. It's the fact that they refuse to follow the script. They see a rule and their first instinct is to find the exception. They see conventional wisdom and immediately look for the unconventional alternative. Do you think he's right? About us forgetting the basics? I watched Marcus leave, that ancient weapon strapped to his back like it belonged there. Which, I was beginning to realize, it did. I think, I said carefully, that humans have been fighting wars since before they had language to describe what they were doing. They've spent their entire evolutionary history perfecting violence in ways we can barely comprehend. And I think we've made a terrible mistake assuming that just because they're new to the galaxy, they're primitive. So what do? I smiled, feeling my protective membranes sliding back over my eyes. We learn, Drift. From them, from the past, from anything that makes us better warriors. Because if humans can teach an old instructor new tricks with a 400-year-old sword, then maybe we're not as advanced as we thought. Class dismissed, I called after the students, though most were already gone. And Marcus? Next time, bring 2 swords. I want to see if you can break physics even harder. His laughter echoed back through the corridor, very human and very alive. Had a feeling my boring teaching career was about to get significantly more complicated, and honestly, I couldn't wait.